When Ireland lives, I do not die. A woman's place is not at home. The fight for freedom, it still goes on. I took up my gun until freedom's day. I pledged to fight for the IRA. In Armagh jail, I served my time. Strip searches were a British crime, degraded me, but they could not see I'd suffered this to see Ireland free. Gibraltar was the place I died. McCann and Savage were by my side. I heard the order so loud and shrill of Thatcher's voice said shoot to kill. So do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there, I do not sleep. Do not stand at my grave and cry. When Ireland lives, I do not die. When Ireland lives, I do not die.
Good evening. How are you? My name is Dana-Ain Davis. I am the director for the Center for the Study of Women in Society. And the center oversees the master's program in Women and Gender Studies at the Graduate Center. And we provide public programming, such as tonight's public programming. I want to first thank the sponsors of tonight's event, the Advanced Research Collaborative, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, the Feminist Press, and the Public Science Project. I also want to thank our staff, Eileen Liang, Jennifer Bay, Naishka Diaz, and Alexandra Johnston. Tonight, we are absolutely delighted to present the talk, Shamrocks and Shackles, Irish Women's Prison Writing During the Civil Rights Movement, 1960s to 1990s, with Dr. Red Washburn. Dr. Washburn is Associate Professor of English and Director of Women and Gender Studies at Kingsborough Community College. They also teach Women and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College. In addition, they are the co-editor of Women's Studies Quarterly, published by the Feminist Press. Red's articles appear in the Journal for the Study of Radicalism, Women's Studies and Interdisciplinary Journal, the Journal of Lesbian Studies and Theory and Praxis, and also Theories and Praxis, Women's and Gender Studies at Community Colleges. Finishing Line Press has published their poetry collection, Crestview Tree Woman. They are co-editor of Sinister Wisdom's Celebrating the Michigan Women's Music Festival, Dump Trump, Legacies of Resistance, and 45 Years, a tribute to lesbian herstory archives. And they are currently working on the trans feminisms issue. Their academic book, Shamrocks and Shackles, Irish Women's Prison Writing 1960s-1990s, and their poetry collection, Birch Philosopher X, are forthcoming next year. In addition, they are working on a book about trans and non-binary literatures and communities 1969 to 2019. Red is a coordinator at the Lesbian Herstory Archives and of the Rainbow Book Fair, as well as on the board of directors of Sinister Wisdom and the Center for LGBTQ Studies. Please offer a warm welcome for Dr. Red Washburn.
Thank you so much, Donna, especially for your intro and your help. Dr. Dana-Ain Davis, round of applause on your end too. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Before I begin the talk, I wanted to thank the Center for the Study of Women in Society, the Feminist Press, and CLAGS in particular, as well as the Women and Gender Studies program at the CUNY Grad Center for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I'm really delighted that Women and Gender Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center is thriving under the leadership of Dr. Davis, and really excited about the continuing intellectual attention on prison and abolition. So there was an earlier talk that was just so wonderful this semester. I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Davis, Eileen Liang, Jennifer Bay, and Alex Johnson for all the wonderful work they do for our colleagues and students. I also want to thank John at the CUNY Graduate Center for his IT help. I want to thank my partner, Audacia Ray, for her help and her continuing support. She's also helping with IT this evening, for which I'm very grateful. And I want to thank the women I interviewed in this study, or who participated in this study: Bernadette Devlin McAliskey, Margaretta D'Arcy, Rosalind Walsh, Mairéad Farrell. Even though she's assassinated, her writing is so important to the work: Ella Dwyer and Martina Anderson. I also want to acknowledge Debbie Rosenfeld, Claire Moses, Patricia Hill Collins, Jan Zlotnick-Schmidt, and Elizabeth Bergman Loiseau for their feedback on my earlier work. So this revision of this book came out of my dissertation. And oftentimes librarians are forgotten, so I want to extend my deepest gratitude to all the librarians who helped me with this project, especially the staff at the Lindenhall Library in Belfast. And lastly, this talk is dedicated to the memory of my grandmother, Bernadette McGuire, and my mom, Colleen Washburn, as well as all the Irish women's lives and voices that need to be lifted up. So I wanted to just include a brief note on language and history and triggers before I get started. And I also just want to note that throughout the presentation, there'll be various slides that will look at some of the figures in the study, as well as introduce some of the historical concepts. So that will begin first, the history. For those of you who are not familiar with Irish history, when I say republic, I'm actually talking about a unified Ireland that is free of British colonialism. So it doesn't mean conservative like the Republican Party in this country, for instance. And then in 1916, after the Easter Rising, the 6 counties in the north were left out of the decolonization transition, which ultimately led to the Irish Civil War. So there's 32 counties in Ireland, not 26, but the 6 counties in Northern Ireland are still not free. Race, culture, and religion mean something different in Ireland. So when we think about whiteness and white privilege in this country, there's a specific tension that happens between many Catholics and Protestants that they themselves have often dubbed apartheid without color, in quotes. And this is Devlin McAliskey's quote. So we might think about the Black and white struggles in the US, particularly with SNCC and the Panthers during the Civil Rights Movement for housing and jobs. And the Irish civil rights movement was actually influenced by the civil rights movement in this country. And there's still support for ongoing civil rights from Ireland now, including for Black Lives Matter. And you'll see a slide at the end about that and George Floyd. The Irish freedom struggle is still ongoing, but Ireland called a peace process, allowing prisoners to be released in '98 as part of the Good Friday Agreement. I want to give a trigger warning that I'm actually going to discuss much state violence, including psychological, physical, and sexual violence. And then lastly, if you're eating dinner, because I know this is a night event, I'm going to be discussing writing with bodily waste, including feces and menstrual blood. So just a heads up. I think it's fascinating, but I like to tell people that if they're eating. So just to give an overview of the study, the presentation is based on my forthcoming book, Shamrocks and Shackles, coming out next year. And the project connects the work of women, leaders, and writers in the 6 counties of Ireland during the anti-colonial civil rights movement, also known as the Troubles. It analyzes political communiques, petitions, news coverage, prison files, personal letters, poetry and short prose, and memoirs of Irish women in the 6 counties, all of whom were targeted, arrested, and imprisoned for their political activities. I argue that these women's lives and words offer a different view of gender and nation, as well as offer a fuller and more inclusive archive of Irish history and literature. Furthermore, I point to the ways in which the politics of everyday life and their cultural work about it is itself a form of feminism, as well as speaking truth to power in a world in which compliance and silence are valued. The project builds on different fields and discourses to reimagine gender and genre as central to an interdisciplinary and intersectional prison archive. I focus on women involved in people's democracy, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, which I'll call the Civil Rights Association, the Irish Republican Socialist Party, the National H Bloc Armagh Committee, and the Provisional Irish Republican Army, which I'll oftentimes just call IRA, Women Against Imperialism, and Sinn Féin, which is the political party of the IRA. I examine leadership roles, individual voices, and cultural productions, and I highlight the work of Bernadette Devlin McAliskey, Margaretta D'Arcy, Rosalind Walsh, Martina Anderson, Ella Dwyer, and Mairéad Farrell. Much of their prison writing was smuggled out on International Women's Day, and it was written on toilet paper or Bible paper, or was oftentimes written on prison walls with their excrement and menstrual blood. All archival material was procured from the following sources: the National Archives of Ireland, the National Library of Ireland, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, the Linen Hall Library, which is really wonderful and has a big Republican wing in Belfast, the Sinn Féin Prisoner War Department, and various online news sources. I also include personal data given to me by some of the writers in this project, especially Rosalind Walsh, with whom I stayed in Belfast when I was there, as well as prison files cleared by governmental bodies. In addition, the project features interviews with selected leaders and writers for supplemental data and interpreting their personal histories and writings. So for instance, I didn't include Devlin McAliskey because there's tons of interviews and she's hard to track down, and Mairéad Farrell because she was assassinated, but all the other writers I talked to at length about their work, and I'm very grateful for that. The project establishes links between several areas: nation and anti-colonialism, race and anti-racism, gender and feminism, literature and genre, content and analysis. I also look at theory and praxis. Overall, the purpose of the project is to recenter Irish women's writing in order to challenge canonization in history and literature. So at this point, I'm going to turn to the literature, and you'll see some images of some of the writers as I'm introducing them. The first person I look at is Bernadette Devlin McAliskey. And I focus on her longer memoir project, The Price of My Soul, which she wrote when she was very young. It was dictated and transcribed in 1969, the year before her arrest for being a leader in the civil rights movement. Her text explores common themes of political membership, activist tactics, and prison solidarity. The growing historical narrative of the civil rights movement has focused on the theme of revolution as a struggle involving the concepts of both nonviolence and armed self-defense. Nonviolence advocated abstaining from violence as a matter of principle, as well as using nonviolent direct action, including sit-ins, boycotts, and marches. Armed self-defense advocated for peaceful resistance unless confronted with violence. Victims of violence fought back against perpetrators in self-defense. Oftentimes, armed self-defense was used as a complementary tactic alongside nonviolence, especially during emergencies such as police brutality. Oftentimes, these are portrayed falsely as oppositional. While Devlin McAliskey contemplated armed self-defense tactics, she was committed unequivocally to nonviolence in practice. She planned most of her debates and demonstrations for People's Democracy nonviolently before venturing into Ulster's electoral politics as the Unity candidate in March of '69. She singled out 3 specific Civil Rights Association marches that indelibly shaped her nonviolence practice in Northern Ireland: the August 24th, 1968, October 5th, 1968, and January 4th, 1969 marches. Police brutality was a major concern for her at these demonstrations. Many times she was forced to defend herself, and although her creed was nonviolence, self-defense ranged from chain-linked arms to throwing stones and making patrol bombs. Racialized colonial violence, for which she received no leniency as a woman, tested her unwavering commitment to nonviolence. During her first demonstration, she describes a peaceful protest. We all jogged along happily, eating oranges and smoking cigarettes, and people came out of their houses to join the fun. Marches were dropping off at every pub along the way, and the whole thing had a sort of good-natured holiday atmosphere. However, the carnival feeling faltered because there were police across the road. She continues, and I quote here, "The meeting got very angry, though it was still a passive anger, with very little pushing and shoving of the police. Some men were calling out that we should force our way through, and the lines of the march were breaking formation and crowding up to the police. Everyone forgot about the accordion playing children about to be squashed between the opposing forces. Then my brother grabbed a megaphone and bellowed through it. Would the drunk men get out of the march? Would the women take the children out of the march and then get themselves out of the march? The organizers announced that we weren't going to force our way through. They were beginning to lose their hold on the marchers, though. People shouted, 'What's the point of saying we'll get civil rights when you stop us from having this civil right?' Betty Clare got up, fearing the movement would be discredited if a fight broke out, and said, 'This is a non-political peaceful demonstration. Anyone who wants to fight should get out and join the IRA.' And the crowd roared back, 'So where do we join?' The majority of the protesters participated in sit-ins and took notes on political misconduct, and in this way, civil rights struggles and Republican struggles coalesced. Opponents left the march, but they ended in singing 'We Shall Overcome,' again inspired by the civil rights movement in this country and a nation once again, to celebrate the success of nonviolence as a political tactic. This passage demonstrates her nonviolent actions, but also her skill in storytelling. She begins with vivid imagery of violence, then she uses anecdotes to build suspense for her readers. She wants readers to feel police brutality and political divisions that result from them. This decision leaves readers to ponder about what tactics they themselves would employ to survive. She is forced to rethink her tactics in this way throughout her book, and her activism depends on those environmental conditions under which she is living. Her memory is infused with both political and aesthetic passion. She did not utilize arms for self-protection. She was able to survive state-sanctioned racist and imperialist violence at the demos, and later by practicing nonviolence. However, without turning to guns, she did turn to self-defense as a complementary tactic, again based on her previous experiences. During the August 12th Battle of the Bogside, for example, she reports changing tactics as follows. What was happening there was that ordinary peaceful people who had no desire to spend 50 hours throwing stones and patrol bombs had realized the harm that had been done to them for a half a century and were learning how to fight back in self-defense. We threw up barricades of rebel, people, and paving stones, anything we could get our hands on to prevent the police from coming straight into the area. Throw them hard and throw them straight. The patrol bombs were made literally by pregnant women and children. Despite the infantilizing conflation of women and children here, she advocates for self-defense as a form of survival in a new way at this time. Since writing The Price of My Soul, she has drafted a practical constitution that embraces political contradictions. So she's involved with a program called STEP in Tyrone that looks at basic rights and has been revisiting some of these issues from her youth in a new way. And she's revised these tactics in particular after her assassination attempt and the peace process in the 90s. She states, "The use of arms is the inevitable result of the lack of democracy, participation, and honesty in politics. People, usually those on the receiving end of many kinds and levels of violence, injustice, and oppression, are forced into war either to defend themselves or because the powerful have used their power to cut off any opportunity for peaceful resolution of the problems. She continues, sometimes when I hear people droning on about how nothing justifies violence, I wish somebody would draw their hand as if to whack them to see how fast they would strike without a second thought. This passage shows that she has drastically shifted her views. As a result of surviving assassination, she currently views self-defense as warranted in situations that concern life and death. She has admitted to many sources that she can't believe that she and her husband actually survived. As a survivor, she has criticized Sinn Féin, calling the peace process a quote-unquote sellout to the Irish Republic, as envisioned by the 1916 Easter Rising and James Connolly in particular. She currently espouses a radical positionality that is inclusive of complementary tactics. And then the next person I'm going to look at is Margaretta D'Arcy. I explored D'Arcy's writing, particularly how she reconstructs her personal image, rewrites history, and affirms her liberatory political vision in her life and work. So she's still an activist even now, and she does a lot of theater in particular. But I focus on her autobiography because of this time period and my own interests. In her article is My Belief that Armagh is a Feminist Issue, Nell McCafferty writes, there is menstrual blood on the walls of Armagh Jail in Northern Ireland. The 32 women on the dirt strike there have not washed their bodies since February 8, 1980. They use their cells as toilets. For more than 200 days now, they have lived amongst their own excrement, urine, and blood. It is my belief that Armagh is a feminist issue that demands our support. As a result of her activism on International Women's Day, D'Arcy was arrested. Her autobiography is a remembering of this time for her and the political prisoners for whom she was advocating. She devotes much thematic attention to the politics of historical veracity and collective truth-telling in her writing. She explains her authorial intentionality as follows. This is a non-dramatic and often rather absurd story of one person who found herself in Armagh prison for 3 months during the period of the long-term prisoners' no-wash protest in 1980. The women in Armagh said to me, tell them everything, and this I have tried to do. And since so few books have been written about Irish women's experience as political prisoners over the last 2 centuries, I felt it essential to put down my own small experience with all of its limitations. Evident in this passage, speaking out was contraband. She notes the British government's usage of covert censorship, and she strategically used her own location as an outsider, as a white Southern working class woman, to tell them everything. She also discusses patriarchal censorship within the Republican struggle. Her incisive criticism of Sinn Féin alludes to Republican women's invisibility in particular. For instance, Sinn Féin failed to acknowledge the hunger strike organized by Mairéad Farrell, Mary Doyle, and Marie Nugent in Armagh right away, in order to keep the focus solely on the hunger strikes in the H blocks, that's where the men were housed, and the deaths of the 9 men there, including Bobby Sands. And if you don't know Bobby Sands, you can watch Hunger, and there's a number of other wonderful sources about Bobby Sands' life. She writes, the emphasis at the meeting was on the men in the H blocks. Women Against Imperialism pointed out that they were also protesting women in Armagh prison. Sinn Féin was taking a rather cautious view of the new women's group. Eventually, such criticism resulted in her expulsion from the organization. In an interview with me, she shares a scathing indictment of Sinn Féin's male-centered tactics. She says, we need to stop seeing women as victims. Armagh women were not victims. Sinn Féin didn't want to see us. They didn't want to see the H blocks and Armagh were connected. Women started our own version of the H blocks. We were political prisoners. Sinn Féin wanted to hide the women in Armagh. The aspects of women's bodies shocked people. Women's periods, births, and internal searches violated puritanical religion. Her book speaks out against this silence. While her regional privilege informs her political location, her feminist work on Irish Republican history is corrective and essential. She writes, only by being able to write my diary could I spill off my frustration and work my way to an understanding of the young woman's position. It recasts women as their own actors in their own script, not ancillary objects to be dealt with post-revolution. She centers the role of gender in the narrative of power and resistance to it. Instead of cowering in silence, she tells them everything about the collective experiences of her fellow intern Republican women. Her reflections are important for understanding her use of visual imagery and symbolism in her autobiography. She blurs the boundaries of politics and art in deliberate ways to call attention to fixed conceptions of reality and of genre. She devotes much time into crafting the symbolism of waste in her writing in particular, and this is the part that I'm really interested in. Republican prisoners produce art out of shitty conditions, quite literally. They swirled and inked the walls with their excrement and their menstrual blood in order to survive. D'Arcy writes, "I've had a shit. It's small and brown, hard as a nugget, carefully wrapped in a tissue. She takes it to the wall. I want to puke. My nostrils are closed. I close my eyes. I open. She has covered a small section of the whirl, a swirl, a small swirl. I apply it to the wall. I press hard. It falls off. I pick it up again, press more lightly, as though I was touching a glass for a table wrapping session at a seance. Let it take itself over to the wall. It moves in thin lines. I am proud. The next time I shit, I'm going to draw pictures. My drawing is lousy. I will practice." D'Arcy's shit is art. She writes about this process by using ironically aesthetic imagery for her fecal art. We can see her touching a glass, drafting thin lines, and drawing pictures. She uses shit to highlight the struggle for life amidst hell for women in prison and its transformation into something of collective and creative value. She also demonstrates the conditions out of which this art is created with allegorical symbolism. She describes these deplorable conditions as follows. "We are called back to the filth, the cells covered with flies. Little happy flies, stubborn flies, flies that when you think you've got them, fly out of the windows, dead flies, dried blood of fat flies, smearing shit on the walls, blue bottles that buzz, a mass of menacing nature trying to take over. Every morning there are hundreds of flies on the walls, on the floors. We swat them. I feel like the proverbial white hunter. I try to have a truce with them. You can have the walls, but leave my body alone. No way. They crawl up my legs, land on my face. I hide under a filthy gray blanket. They sneak in. No mercy, no surrender. I am Paisley, a unionist. I lash out, jumping on my springs and on my bars. Carefully, I get some of them. They are stunned. I think they are dead. No, they recover. They are like the provost, the IRA, unconquerable. They are everywhere, and then the little ones that live in the skirting boards, thousands of flies live there." This passage, which is one of my favorites, is flooded with adjectives that invoke flies as literal presence. Little, happy, stubborn, dead, dried, and fat. She also transforms them into symbols. The flies' bodies invoke a colonial presence in her imagination. She fights back, swatting them, but they continue to oppress her like the white hunters. They refuse a truce. They capture her body. They crawl on her, land on her, hide in her parcels, but she will not surrender. At the end, she identifies the human fly swatters as the IRA and the fly shit hovers as the colonial enemy. Her writing is rich in detail and in symbols in this passage and throughout her book. And the next person I turn to is Rosalind Walsh. And I think Rosalind Walsh's story is particularly interesting, and I'm hoping that she joined us tonight, even though it's very late in Belfast. But Rosalind Walsh explores many themes in her poetry. In particular, I was interested in her themes of race, religion, and nationalism in her collection Aiming Higher. She wrote that collection in prison. For this presentation, I'm just focusing on To My Silent Church. But I encourage you to read more of her work on her website, rosalindwalsh.com, and in any archives. For more than 5 years as a voluntary social worker and devout Catholic, Walsh endured incessant harassment by British security forces due to her working class Catholic Republican background and the nature of her profession. Her alliances with Sinn Féin earned her the attention of the system. She refused to surrender. She told me in an interview, "I think that being in prison reinforced the belief that there's a difference between law and justice. I'm a Republican, and that doesn't make me a bad person. They tried to kill my desire for freedom. I'm lying in a prison, but the wind is everywhere." Poetry became one of the only mediums through which she could express herself and resist oppression. Prison reinstated my voice through poetry. She explained to me because it flowed even more in there. In my interview with her, she stated, I write about some unfair issues. I write to change, and I write to change the form. It's okay to say to hell with tradition. As long as we're being listened to, that's what's important. She started writing on the prison walls and ceiling with green markers, a forbidden activity at the time. She said, eventually there was barely an inch of paint in any direction that hadn't had one of my poems on it. Both prisoners and guards read her poetry religiously. Guards were forced to accept it as an exception for art's sake. Prisoners demanded it. I was happy because I was surrounded by my own words. I was sculpting my own voice, she revealed to me. Words functioned as a form of emotional and political solace for her. She surrounded herself literally with her writing. It was all she could see, and her hope embodied in her words. She composed many poems during that somber period, 1971 to 1973. Walsh's To My Silent Church addresses themes of silence and speech, as well as religion and politics within Catholic Republican communities based in West Belfast during the Troubles. Using direct address, she says, I wrote this poem out of my frustration and disappointment with the Catholic Church in 1973. So I'm going to pause here. Before I get into analyzing the poem, I actually wanted to honor Rosalind's voice and play a video of her reading at ARMA. So she visited ARMA 40 years later. So we're going to turn to that now, and then I'll come back to the poem.
Hello. It's so hard to believe that I'm back in this cell. I was interned here in this prison, Armagh, 42 years ago, and this was my cell. As soon as I came in, I recognised the floor, the blue floor which I painted. The walls were covered in my poetry, and so also is the ceiling, but it has been painted over and the paint's off. I'm here today, and I want to read some of the poems that I had on the wall, and also some of the poems I wrote afterwards. It's about my life here and my life afterwards. So I'll start with the first poem, which was To My Silent Church. I wrote this poem out of frustration and disappointment with the Catholic Church in 1973 in relation to Republican prisoners. To my silent church, silence or cell, divided nations conquer well. For imitation love of peace, give all up to the oppressor, lose all, forget those who have given all, so you can live in your imitation home made of imitation security. Silence or cell, I chose cell. My words were quiet, but I was not silent. I did not want the cell. It came because I could not bear the silence. The silence was imitation, not truth, incomprehensible. Christ died because he could not stand the silence. Because of your silence, I am condemned to be without freedom. I am therefore dead. Speak now, silent church. The The next poem.
Okay, so y'all have heard Walsh reading her poems. I encourage you to watch the whole video if you have time and interest. But I'm going to focus on this poem, To My Silent Church. Evident in this poem, it was deeply troubling for Walsh that many priests refused to speak out against political tensions existing between Catholics and Protestants, including both violence and internment. She argues that failure to take a stand against injustice demonstrates a divide between religious theory and direct practice, not legitimized in the Bible. And remember, again, she's a devout Catholic. To My Silent Church serves as an example of dramatic repetition. Most pronounced is the sibilant sounds in the first lines of the first two stanzas, silence or cells. These sounds are used to create an ethos of moral disgust. The historical explanation for the recurring hissing is identified in the following lines. Divided nations conquer well. For imitation love of peace, give all to the oppressor. Lose all. Forget those who have given all, so you can live in your imitation home made of imitation security. British colonialism has divided Ireland into a country with 26 counties and 6 counties in Northern Ireland. The colonial presence is ubiquitous. Currency, government, language, culture, religion, housing, and jobs. And again, this still continues. Colonialism has maintained its presence, indicated by the rhyming connection of conquest and internment, sell, and well. Imitation is repeated 3 times for emphasis here. The church is mocked and then indicted for surrendering its morals and ethics to the oppressor, the British authorities, to maintain its avaricious privileges, abandoning mendicant and humble standards. The British government will continue to be the church's institutional father and benefactor. For her, the church upholds imitation morality. It has forgotten its commitment to love, respect, and equality for all people, including Republican Catholics and those who are political prisoners in their fight against this inequality and colonialism. The second stanza, also beginning with silence or cell, moves from informative to responsive in context. She branches out and reacts to such grave injustices. She writes, I chose cell. Here she personifies her fate. It took her. I did not want the cell. It came because I could not bear the silence, she says. The cell creeps towards her and encloses her for taking up too much space, too much air. She speaks out, albeit with fear. The chain between the prison and the cell is the trope of synecdoche here. My words were quiet, but I was not silent. The assonant sounds in quiet and silent demonstrate her subtle refusal to restrain her words, even in prison. For Walsh, silence is not the truth, a bloody lie, and incomprehensible. Silence cannot be understood. Voice creates meaning. For her, discrimination leads to death and destruction, a repugnant morality. The last stanza is anchored in biblical allusion. It begins, Christ died because he could not stand the silence. Christ is the symbol of authentic Christianity, according to Walsh, which the church has abandoned. These symbols become disjunctive entities. She writes, because of your silence. This line is a critique of historical examples of indictment and injustice endorsed by the church, the murder of Christ, the Crusades, and the Troubles, for instance. Religion in its various sects is not the sole medium in which morality can be practiced. Nevertheless, it serves as an institutional example that purports to uphold an exemplary morality. For that reason, the Catholic Church's bloody hands make the abuse particularly problematic for Walsh. Walsh, one of the countless Republican Catholics targeted here, becomes targeted for her humanitarian work. I am condemned to be without freedom. I am therefore dead, she says. She establishes connections between Christ and herself here. The repetitive past tense in Christ died and I am condemned, along with the alliterative Christ died and I am therefore dead, make this link apparent. The loudness of silence is evident in all 8 lines it is used. However, at the end, it becomes piercing in its inaudible volume. She demands, speak, talk now, silent ones. The address changes from the church to those who have resisted a fake morality. She argues that silence causes death. The poem ends with a clarion call for resurrection. The dead will become martyrs. The church must vocalize itself, she commands. The word is out and definitive, just like the period that seals the poem. And in this last section, I look at Mairéad Farrell, Ella Dwyer, Martina Anderson. All of them, I am looking at their prose, the letters that they composed in prison. So moving from longer memoirs to poetry and then letters, epistolary. These writers wrote as a historical corrective, as a coalitional tactic, and as a collective voice. I am interested in mapping out the rhetorical and anti-colonial hallmarks of a gendered prose style as it appears in their work. These women, like many political prisoners, faced egregious treatment in England and Ireland. So many of the Irish prisoners were moved to England because it was just another form of punishment, similar to like a lot of civil rights activists in this country from New York City were moved upstate. So it was a way to keep them from their families. So I just want to note that's why I mentioned England here. Loss of intellectual, emotional, physical, and sexual freedom is standard. They are normative patterns of torture and used as a means of social control. The record of these women's experiences in prisons reminds us that modern discipline does not rely entirely on the panoptical and internalized surveillance, but rather have been gendered, sexualized, and racialized. I use these in fusing history, biography, and rhetorical analysis. I address themes of assault, harassment, and negligence in particular. State violence on the body and then self-harm on the bodies from hunger strikers as protest against that state violence was both a form of state violence and gender resistance to state violence, as well as expressive as cultural citizenship, affirming their memories and bodies through writing. Mairéad Farrell experienced heinous acts of physical violence during Black February. In a letter to her parents written on February 7, 1980, she gives an overview of Black February as follows. On Thursday, February 7th at approximately 12:15, 40 male officers ran into the wing and surrounded the girls. Then about 30 female officers joined them. The prison authorities then informed me that there was going to be a general raid. Nobody was allowed back to their cells, and everyone had to go in single into association cells. The male officers never gave us a chance. They immediately jumped us and started beating us all around. After all seemed relatively calm, we managed to get into our cells. We were split up into them. We stayed there for hours. We had no dinner, and we were allowed nothing to drink. We remained there while both male and female officers searched our cells, which were completely wrecked after the search. We were not allowed to exercise, nor go to the toilet or get washed. We were locked down 24 hours and allowed nothing to eat or drink. Later correspondence with her father the same day details the horrific abuse she endured. She writes, I was surrounded by 9 to 12 female officers. They had me up against the door, kicking and punching me the whole time. Some of them grabbed my legs and arms, twisting my arms backwards. Another couple were hanging onto my hair while officers carried me down the wing. Other officers pulled my hair in the opposite direction. Eventually, they threw me into an empty cell. A few of them came after me and were kicking away at me, but then ran out and closed the door. Eventually, the medical staff noted the bruises and tended to her cuts on her left arm, but they still refused to believe that the bald patch on her head was from the encounter. This incident reflects outrageous violations in power in order to contain resistance. Irish Republican women are commenced a no-wash protest, also known as the dirt strikes or dirty protest, under duress as a response to the events of Black February. On February 8, 1980, Farrell explains this involuntary participation as follows, and I'm quoting here, we have been forced into the position of dirt strikes as our pots are overflowing with urine and excrement. We have emptied them out into the spy holes into the wing. The male officers nailed them closed, but we broke them off using our chairs. Economical solutions to no wash became reduced to decoration. She writes, our walls are covered in excrement. There was nothing else to do with it. You can't pile it in a corner. That would be unbearable. It's not that bad. It dries and the smell is not bad after an hour. The urine is the worst smell. You'll probably find that hard to believe, but the stench of it just clings to the air. Menstrual blood too is smeared on the wall, making headlines instantly for its gendered markers. The only relief from the rancid odor was an hour outside every day, the only time they were permitted to exit their cells. She writes, we're freezing by the time the hour has passed, but it's worth it. Rain, hail, or snow, we're out in it. Believe me, that fresh air is worth catching pneumonia from. Approximately 30 Republican women on this protest were denied basic human rights to hygiene for security reasons. Anderson sums it up well, stating that they were, quote, living in dirt, eating dirt, seeing dirt, and thinking dirt. Deemed unsuccessful by the European Commission of Human Rights for the men in long cash, the dirty protest escalated into hunger strikes that were spearheaded by Bobby Sands and the H blocks. Hunger strikes were another form of resistance for political prisoners. Mairéad Farrell, Mairéad Nugent, and Mary Doyle demanded the right to refuse work, to organize for educational recreational facilities, to have one weekly visit, parcel, and letter, to associate with other political prisoners. In Ireland, it was the first hunger strike by women, referred to as quote-unquote girl terrorists, and a concerted effort to infantilize and criminalize them. Farrell, serving as a spokesperson, told the press, "The cause of Irish freedom is not a criminal cause, but a political cause, and in order to assert this, we're going on hunger strike. We are prepared to fast to death if necessary." After 19 days, it ended abruptly, however. They pledged their solidarity to the men in long cash who started the hunger strikes earlier in order to save their lives there. So many of these men were close to death. Farrell was assassinated by the British government shortly after her release. Strip searching is another pervasive form of physical and psychological torture. Ella O'Dwyer and Martina Anderson actually called it psychological rape. They claimed they suffered from acute post-traumatic stress disorder and spearheaded a human rights campaign to challenge this practice from the first day they were interned. Republican activists were strip searched during cell searches and changes, before and after court appearances, visits, and hospital trips. Prison guards had unbridled liberty to demand strip searches for security reasons. Strip searches commenced at Armagh in 1982, that November, and then extended to British prisons in Brixton and Durham. The procedure is detailed as follows. While you are naked, you are asked if you have your period. If you have your period, you're forced to remove your sanitary protection. A paper bag is provided for your tampon or towel. The bag is then opened and the contents are examined. Your body is then inspected. You are told to turn completely around so no part of your body is left unseen. Anyone with long hair is ordered to gather their hair up in their hands and hold it on top of their heads. This, say the women, makes the entire sordid affair seem like a slave trade market. This passage reflects the underlying dehumanization of the process, delineating connections between sexism, menstruation, and racism, the slave trade market, as interlocking systems of colonial power and containment in prison. Refusal for strip searches includes 7 nights loss of association and solitary confinement, and women still were searched by force. Mairéad Farrell lost all of her visitation rights after October 1983 for flat out refusing strip searches. In my interviews with O'Dwyer and Anderson, they confessed they were strip searched 5 to 6 times a day, along with body searches and frisks at least 4 times a day by more than 600 men. O'Dwyer and Anderson began a relentless letter campaign to castigate this policy. O'Dwyer told me, "We fought the system with all we had, mainly our wits," to which Anderson, clearly in conversation with O'Dwyer, reiterated, "Our only pen was our weapon." And just as an aside, both of these women completed their education in prison. O'Dwyer got her PhD and went on to write a book, The Rising of the Moon. And Martina Anderson continued on and graduated and then went into a government office as the MEP for FOIL. So that was something that they both worked on together in addition to writing to support their basic human rights. Both of these women commenced their outreach by providing rudimentary information about strip searching procedures. In Anderson's letter to her solicitor, Michael Fisher, published in the Morning Star on February 11, 1986, she details this process. "I walk into the wing, knowing what lies ahead. Here are 2 empty cells, and I'm ordered into one of them. Once in the cell, 2 prison officers order me to take my clothes off, while a third holds up a blanket shoulder high. The 4th stands watching. Realizing that their eyes are constantly looking at me over the blanket and feeling so helpless knowing I can't do anything, I start to remove my blouse and bra. The officers take them to check, and then I put on a so-called dressing gown, which is like a scruffy surgical gown. Feeling completely demoralized, I start to remove the bottom half of my clothes. Every last bit of my underwear is scrutinized. When my clothes have been searched, I dress, and then one of the prison officers starts putting his hands through my hair." In the same publication, O'Dwyer adds, Prison officers rub my hair and ears, and like an animal, I have to lift my feet. They are told me they can lift my breast forcibly if they decide to, and even probe my body folds. I know that every part of me has been touched, quote unquote, accidentally or deliberately since I've arrived there. This practice is gendered, sexualized, and racialized, and is a form of psychological violence and rape. O'Dwyer and Anderson shift from procedural considerations to statistical information. In January 1986, Anderson writes to the Troops Out Now movement, from December 2nd until the 27th, Ella had 21 strip searches, 4 cell searches, and 2 cell changes. I had 23 strip searches, 6 cell searches, and 2 cell changes. That should give you an idea of the daily harassment which we've had to endure in this hellhole. These occurrences of sexual torture escalate drastically in April and May of 1986, in O'Dwyer's letter written on October 8th, 1986. She says, Martina had to endure 46 strip searches, 7 cell searches, a cell change, and I had 43 strip searches, 7 cell searches, and a cell change. The figures for May border on the incredible, with each of us having 61 strip searches and 2 cell and strip searches on each consecutive Sunday. It was suggested that they would strip us after Mass, as they did after dental and gynecological visits. This document highlights the overt state-sanctioned gendered, sexual, and racialized violence that these women experienced, that they had to endure this after Mass, in addition to gynecological visits. It addresses the key issue, control, reveals how it is mystified in practices and in the rhetoric of quote-unquote security, and underlines the contradictions of the criminal justice system. And to conclude, I just want to summarize that the project itself focuses on rethinking and recasting women's voices and words across the spectrum of difference in order to document and promote the ongoing freedom struggle in Ireland from a feminist perspective. This repositioning of Irish women and their work as center is essential to archiving social movements for civil rights and cultural productions about them, including within a colonial context. Lastly, it is important to note that this tradition is relevant even now during this moment of transatlantic solidarity with Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movement, including in Ireland, post-Easter Rising Centennial, as part of the big conversations happening now around the impacts of political repression and state attacks on social justice advocates and the harms of the carceral state. Thank you for listening, everyone. And now we're going to move on to a Q&A facilitated by Dr. Davis. And I know Donna is going to pick wonderful questions.
Yes, I will. Thank you so much. That was so incredible. I had a question that I was going to start off with, but we have questions. And since we don't have a lot of time, I thought I'll go straight to those. So the first question is, where were the women kept? Which prison? How long were they kept there? Liza is interested in the women's experience of the Troubles and wonders if you can recommend some resources.
Yeah, this is a great question. So for the most part, many of the women were interned in Armagh. So that's in the north. And the height of internment was in 71 to 73, but it extended into the 80s, as we just learned about the dirt strikes and the hunger strikes that happened in 80 and later in 81. There were a number of other prisons. For instance, like Ella O'Dwyer, Martina Anderson, a number of them, for folks who weren't at Armagh, were in Brixton and Durham and Maghaberry, and they were all in England. Again, like similar to the Black Panthers having the busing program here in this country, so families could see their loved ones as far as like Canada from the city. So many of those women were in England. So there's some really wonderful sources. I would highly recommend Albie Smith's work. She's one of the most famous practitioners of women and gender studies, started many of the programs in Dublin, in particular at UCD in Dublin. Could also look at Linda Conley's work. Brian Dooley wrote a really fascinating book about the civil rights movements and transatlantic connections between the US and Ireland. He focuses mostly on men, but there's some women in there. But what I'd actually recommend is the women's own writing. So besides the unpublished ones I mentioned, there's a really wonderful book that's edited by Evelyn Brady and a number of other folks, called In the Footsteps of Anne. And it's a compilation of women's prison writing. And it came out probably about 10 years ago. And I'm not sure if it's out of print, but it's absolutely wonderful. I highly recommend that.
Great.
And also, I just want to say that these women, most of these women were released in 1998 as part of the Good Friday Agreement peace process. Some of them refused because they didn't want to, quote unquote, sell out, but the majority of them were released in 98.
Thank you. Another question from the audience is from Maya Manovich, who says, thank you for the presentation. This was a completely new subject for them and feels a bit ignorant as they've never heard about freedom struggle of women in Ireland, and wants to know how you got interested in the subject. And I would just add on to that, the degree to which your interest in the subject overlapped with civil rights work in the United States, in the Black Civil Rights Movement, and if there were letters exchanged between women in Northern Ireland and women in the US at that time. So that's 2 questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think these are both great questions. So just personally, I got interested in this topic because I was really interested in civil rights activism and thinking about how to be a white ally. And as I started digging into civil rights history in this country and civil rights history in Ireland, I kept thinking about where the invisible markers were. And I came across this really amazing film that hopefully you can track down. It's very hard to find, called The Road of Women by Melissa Thompson. I met her at Queer Space in Belfast, and then later at Rocky Sullivan's in Brooklyn, which is a bar, but it's mainly a site of education and culture and activism. So it's a community space. It's not just about getting drunk and dancing. It's a really wonderful space, like open to the community. So I highly recommend that space in Red Hook. So I saw that film and I talked to Melissa Thompson. And then the more I read, I just wanted to find out where all the gaps were. So I went to Ireland and I just dug through the archives and found a lot of the materials. And you know, it's very dorky, but I was really into it. Dust aside, go read these women's words. They're available, especially at the Linden Hall Library. So that's how I got interested in the first part. My family is also from Ireland, not the North, but the South, Cork and Kerry. And I didn't know much about the North. So I wanted to figure out why I didn't know much about the North and what was happening there. Just FYI, all the murals that you see in this presentation are really amazing to see in person. You know, if we ever get to travel again post-pandemic, and if people can afford it, highly recommend that you go on one of those mural tours. The second part of the question is, there's a lot of overlap between the movements. So as I noted, and the Irish Civil Rights Movement was modeled off of the Civil Rights Movement in this country, ranging from, you know, SNCC and the SCLC to the Panthers, to Black Liberation Army. And it was evident in much of their marches. You could read Brian Dooley's book, Black and Green, if you want to explore that. So it's really fascinating, and that has continued, as you saw the last 2 slides with Bernadette Devlin McAliskey meeting with several Panthers. Ashanti Alston, a number of them. That's one connection. And the other is that there's just ongoing support, transatlantic support, not just in the US, but in like Palestine and Cuba, any kind of colonial territory. And the US, I would argue, is a colonial territory for many folks of color, for Indigenous folks, among others. But you can see the murals like Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to the recent one of George Floyd. I'm hoping that there'll be other murals, particularly for like Breonna Taylor, among other folks, including women and or trans people. But there's a rich history there, and I would really encourage you to see it, not just in the writing, but in art and in some of the history books.
We have a couple of more minutes, so I'll ask you, here's a question from Twitter, since there's the Twitter feed of this event. They wanted to know if you, ask about what you think about your work in relation to the anthropologist whose name I'm not going to be able to say it very well, Arextacha. Begona, I think, Aristacha. Do you know who she is? She wrote about basically the same events.
Mhm.
Anthropologist. I'll have to look up the title of the book. I don't know if you've heard of her. And then, so she wrote about the same events and the actors, and later extended her discussion or analysis to movements in Basque Country. So I guess the question was, are you familiar with that person, whose name I'm not pronouncing particularly well, but if you
Mhm.
were, maybe you know.
Yeah, so she and a number of folks, Linda Conley, Tina O'Toole, there are a number of them wrote about similar issues, not just within an Irish context, as you noted. And I know there's some folks who've been talking about developments between connections between Ireland and Palestine too. So my understanding of her work is that she's focusing more on the activism and shaping the rhetoric around the movements.
Right.
So like looking at cultures and communities of women and the work that they're doing and community organizing. It's been a while since I read her stuff, but her work is really great and I'd recommend her work. Whereas like I feel like my work is actually honoring women's words. So like actually looking at their writing and seeing it as a form of art, but also a form of history and storytelling. So I would say that my intervention is less anthropological and more historical and more literary. And I just want to throw it out there as an interdisciplinary person. I like to think that my work is really having conversations across, between, and against disciplines and putting those disciplines in conversation with one another in really complicated ways. So like pulling theory, history, literature, sociology, pulling them all together. And also saying like, how do we complicate it even more?
Right, right.
I know you get it, Donna.
I get it. I totally get it. I'm all about integrating anthropology and literature, by the way, and history. So a question from Stevie is, what surprised you the most from your interviews and your research? I always love that question.
I really love Irish humor. I really do. It's very dark. So, one of the interviews I did with one of the women, she was smoking a cigarette and she was saying, I don't even care that I'm smoking. I survived internment. I'm not going to die. So, humor. Also, that they were just so generous and open about their experiences. So many of the writers like took me down to their basements and they're like, look at all these things. And they feel a sense of resistance and resiliency instead of just feeling like kind of like cowered down in trauma. So they remember the trauma, but they're also seeing it as a way to uplift their voices. So the combination of the humor around it, and also the joy and actually reshaping the narrative has been really exciting to me. And also, I just will say, it was really cool, and I have one of them, to see the toilet paper that they wrote on, which is so flimsy.
Wow.
And Bible paper. And so, yeah, that was some of the more fascinating stuff that I remember.
Okay. So it is 7 o'clock, but if you're willing to stay on for a minute more or a few minutes more, I want to get to a couple of questions that are down at the bottom of the list because people at the end barely get their voices heard, right? So one question comes from Indira, which is, how do you see their legacy 22 years later? Political prisoners got recognition. Is there something in the educational settings in Northern Ireland and the South and here that pays homage to their legacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. So there are entire museums and books dedicated to them. Mostly they've done this by themselves. So Eileen Hickey, who has passed on, did a number of different kind of like archaeological dig projects, one of which was creating the Republican Museum. And then Evelyn Brady's book, In the Footsteps of Anne, like putting that together for the prisoners so people would know their history. And I think that there's a lively discussion about prison and abolition that's happening, not just in this country, but transnationally, especially since the pandemic. So I feel like, I've taught a number of prison classes at Hunter that these courses are being seen as more necessary in this context because there's a demand for them. And I also just say that women and gender studies has really flourished in Ireland, and a lot of things have shifted politically, not just reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and that has really created demand for funding for this interdisciplinary work, as well as community centers. So like the shift has moved more into education and culture, and that's not to say there's not community activism still happening, but it's become institutionalized in this way that like you're supposed to know both the knowledge and the activism about it in order to continue that legacy.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question that a person is requesting that you write the name of the films and the titles of the books that you recommended in the chat.
Sure.
So everyone should know that this is being recorded, and it's going to be available in about a week, just FYI. But so maybe before we leave, if you could put those things in the chat. And I think I'll do one last question, which is, can we consider that the struggles these women endured had softened the movement that women are doing today, or is it the same fight that women are dealing with today?
I feel like that's a really complicated question. So I see history as an ongoing, well, at least the struggle as an ongoing civil rights and anti-colonial movement. So I see them in conversation with one another, even though they're not linear. So I see them as, having shifting language and experiences and activism around it. But I don't necessarily think it's softer. I think that things have changed. So, I think like, for instance, a lot of Republican women have gone into other fields. So for instance, Martina Anderson now works for the government, but she's doing incredible activism, particularly around reproductive rights issues, human rights issues, immigrant issues, LGBTQ issues. Someone like Ella O'Dwyer and Rosalind Walsh, they're full-time writers. I think there's definitely fewer assassinations. I can say that, like, Bernadette Devlin McAliskey was almost assassinated, and Mairéad Farrell was assassinated. And that's not to say there aren't those things happening. But I think things have shifted a lot. So I do see them as in conversation, but I from the research that I've done, and also many of the folks I know in Ireland, and including family members, it's moved into intellectual and cultural activism, and specific community organizing things, such as like Bernadette Devlin McAliskey's STEP program in Tyrone, where she's helping immigrant communities. She's helping like Indian, Pakistani, all the different immigrant communities, the connection of the British colonialism, among others. And yeah, I mean, there's still a fight, but I think that right now it's shifted because of the peace process. So people are working more within the system in reformist ways. But I mean, that may shift, I don't really know. I think that given some of the protests here, that things have shifted a lot transnationally. So yeah, I think that things are always kind of shifting, but I think they're in conversation with one another.
Well, thank you so much. I see that Professor Red Washburn is putting things in the chat, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. I want to thank everyone for coming to this wonderful and incredibly informative event. And I want to thank you, Red, for all of this amazing work. Cannot wait until the books are out, both of them. And I want to thank John, Jennifer, Eileen, and Audacia for helping to make this an incredible event for our audience. So for the audience members, it looks like there are some resources in the chat, and you're going to be able to see things. So we're going to stay on for just one more minute so that you can maybe make a copy of the information. People are saying, thank you so much for this talk. Some people said, thank you for your passion, for all your research and sharing your findings. Some people were thanking the center for supporting it. So you're welcome. It's a total joy of ours to do so. And so maybe when the book comes out, you can come back and do a full-on book talk. Oh, wait. And then people, very cool and inspiring. If people really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank you again, Donna, for helping this whole thing come together. This talk was rescheduled, and I know that's a nightmare logistically at the Grad Center. So I appreciate that. And also, you know, the Center for the Study of Women in Society and the MA program, Women and Gender Studies, it's just the intellectual life in Q&A. Like, take advantage of these events, CLAGS, the Feminist Press. Y'all are doing such great work, so inspiring. And also, Donna's very modest. Donna's own book is fascinating. You should read her work. And I want to thank Eileen and Jennifer again for their help, and Audacia and John and everyone who helped put this event together. I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful evening. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Be safe.